Hey guys, tonight we're going somewhere deeply familiar and somehow deeply terrifying. The American grocery store. Not the chaotic, fluorescent-lit battlefield you know today with its 47 varieties of oat milk and a man in the chip aisle who's been standing there since Tuesday. I mean the whole journey. How America went from women in white gloves, pushing chrome carts past towers of Jell-O molds, to grown adults shuffling through self-checkout in pajama pants and a quiet spiritual crisis. This is the story of how Americans dressed, shopped, cooked, ate, and slowly stopped caring what anyone thought about any of it, and how the grocery store became the unlikely mirror of the entire national personality. Before you get comfortable, a quick and genuinely heartfelt thank you to the viewer who suggested this topic. You know who you are, and honestly, this one has been sitting in the back of my brain for weeks now, taking up space next to my grocery list and mild existential dread. Comments like yours are why this channel exists, and I mean that. If you enjoy what I do here, please hit like and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure, no guilt, just vibes. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is, because it's always someone's 2 a.m. somewhere, and I find that strangely comforting. Also, the channel is now on Spotify. Link is in the description if you'd rather drift off there tonight. Now, dim the lights, put on a fan, pull that blanket up, get horizontal if you haven't already, because we are going in. But first, let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered what your grandmother was actually doing at the grocery store in 1955, and why she looked like she was attending a small formal event? Did women really wear heels to buy canned peas? Who decided that a housewife's entire social reputation could hinge on whether she served the right brand of mayonnaise? What exactly happened in the 1970s that convinced American food scientists that anything could be improved by adding cheese powder and putting it in a foil pouch? Why did we collectively decide, somewhere around 1987, that a meal wasn't a meal unless it came in a box and took 4 minutes? And how did we get from I made this from scratch to impress my neighbours to I ate cereal over the sink and I'm not apologising? When did the freezer aisle stop being a convenience and start being a lifestyle? And perhaps most importantly, at what exact cultural moment did it become acceptable to run errands in the same clothes you slept in while buying enough snacks to survive a minor apocalypse? Congratulations, you've just woken up in America. The year is 1955. Your cart has chrome wheels, your girdle is doing its level best, and the store smells like floor wax and possibility. Let's go shopping. Before the supermarket, Americans bought their food from multiple small specialty shops. The butcher, the baker, the canned goods man on the corner who always seemed vaguely suspicious. Then, somewhere in the 1930s and 40s, a radical idea took hold. What if you could buy everything in one enormous room? The supermarket didn't just change where Americans shopped. It changed how they thought about food, abundance, and the quiet pleasure of pushing a wheeled cart through a building the size of an airplane hangar, selecting from more varieties of canned tomatoes than any single human could ever need. To understand how revolutionary this was, you have to go back further. In the early 1900s, your weekly food shopping was a multi-stop operation that required actual planning. You went to the butcher for meat, the greengrocer for produce, the dry goods store for flour and sugar, and the dairy for milk and eggs. Every transaction involved a real human being who knew your name, your family, your preferences, and your credit situation. It was personal. It was community. It was also, depending on the weather and the length of your list, an entire morning you were never getting back. Then came Clarence Saunders. In 1916 in Memphis, Tennessee, Saunders opened a store called Piggly Wiggly and did something that sounds obvious now, but was genuinely shocking at the time. He let customers walk through the store and pick up their own items. Before Piggly Wiggly you handed your list to a clerk, the clerk disappeared into the back and whatever came out was what you got. Saunders said no. He put the products on shelves. He gave customers a basket. He said, essentially, browse, help yourself. And Americans, given permission to wander freely through a room full of food, turned out to be extremely good at it. The basket became a cart. The cart got wheels. The store got bigger. By the 1930s, King Cullen in New York was being called the world's first true supermarket, a massive, no-frills warehouse-style store where you could buy everything in one trip at prices lower than any specialty shop. Michael Cullen, the man behind it, had pitched the idea to Kroger years earlier. They turned him down. He opened his own store in a converted garage in Queens, and within 2 years it was doing more business than most grocery chains dreamed of. Kroger noticed. Everyone noticed. The timing was not coincidental. The Great Depression had made Americans aggressively focused on price, and the supermarket model, high volume, low margin, no frills, was built for exactly that mood. You didn't need atmosphere. You didn't need a clerk who knew your grandmother. You needed bread at a price that didn't make you want to sit down on the floor. After World War II, the supermarket exploded. Suburbia needed stores, and stores needed suburbs, and the two grew together across the American landscape like they'd been planning this all along. By the 1950s, the average supermarket had grown to 10,000 square feet. By the 70s, 20,000. By the 90s, stores were crossing 60,000 square feet, adding pharmacies, florists, banks, and hot food counters, evolving from a place to buy groceries into a place where you could, in theory, spend your entire Saturday without technically leaving the building. But here's the thing. Nobody talks about when they talk about the supermarket's rise. It didn't just change shopping, it changed eating. When you can see every option at once, when every brand, every product, every variety is right there on the shelf, demanding your attention, you start buying things you didn't know you needed. You start comparing, you start experimenting, you start picking up that can of something you've never tried simply because it was at eye level and the label was green. The supermarket created the modern American consumer, and the modern American consumer immediately started filling their cart with things their grandmothers wouldn't have recognized as food. The supermarket promised everything in one place, and for better or worse, it kept that promise. In 1955, going to the grocery store was not a casual errand. For the American housewife, it was closer to a public appearance. You wore your good clothes, you fixed your hair, and you pushed your cart with the quiet confidence of a woman who had a meal plan and was not afraid to use it. The grocery store was social theatre, a place where other women evaluated your choices, where brand loyalty was a form of character, and where arriving without a list was roughly equivalent to showing up to church in your swimsuit. The stakes were real. If you were a housewife in 1955, your entire social worth was concentrated in your domestic performance, and the grocery store was the opening act. What you bought said everything about who you were. You purchased name brands because generics implied financial distress and possibly a character flaw. You bought the right cut of meat because the wrong one meant you didn't know what you were doing, and word travelled fast. You selected your produce carefully because soft tomatoes or yellowing lettuce would make their way back to the dinner table, and the dinner table was where your competence was evaluated on a nightly basis by people who lived with you. Getting dressed for this was not optional. Photographs from the era are almost disorienting to look at now. Women in dresses, heels, and coordinated accessories standing in front of soup displays, looking as though they might be on their way somewhere after this. They were not on their way somewhere. This was the somewhere. Shopping was a social event, and social events required proper presentation. To show up in yesterday's house dress with your hair not done was to advertise, loudly and publicly, that something had gone wrong in your home. The cart itself was a new kind of freedom, complicated as that sounds. The shopping cart had been invented in 1937 by a supermarket owner named Sylvan Goldman, who watched customers stop shopping when their handbaskets got too heavy and thought, what if the basket had wheels? The early carts were clunky metal frames, and customers were initially suspicious of them. Men thought they looked effeminate, women thought they looked like baby carriages. Goldman hired actors to push carts around the store to demonstrate their acceptability, which is one of the stranger sentences in American retail history. But it worked. Within a decade, the cart was standard, and by the 1950s, it had become an extension of the housewife's domestic identity, to be filled thoughtfully and pushed with purpose. The social dynamics in those aisles were quiet but constant. Women made note of what other women were buying. There was judgment about portion sizes, and judgment about brands, and judgment about whether you were buying convenience items, which could mean either that you were modern and efficient or that you were cutting corners, depending on who was watching. The checkout line was particularly loaded. Everything on that conveyor belt was visible, readable, a brief autobiography of your household. There was also genuine pride in it. For all the pressure, many women in this era genuinely loved grocery shopping in a way that's hard to fully translate now. It represented competence, planning, expertise. Knowing your store's layout, knowing which day the produce came in fresh, knowing exactly how much ground beef you needed for a week's worth of meals, these were real skills, practiced and honed. The housewife who could do this efficiently and stylishly was not performing domesticity reluctantly. She was, in the vocabulary available to her at the time, genuinely excellent at her job. It was a narrow job. It was a constraining job. But inside those chrome-wheeled carts and those carefully pressed dresses was a kind of mastery that would take decades to untangle from the system that had required it. Walk into a supermarket in any decade and something happens to you almost immediately. A subtle loosening of the wallet, a slow expansion of the shopping list, a growing certainty that you absolutely do need this decorative tin of shortbread you've never once purchased before. This was not an accident. Supermarkets were among the first retail environments to be deliberately designed to manipulate human behavior, using layout, lighting, smell, and music to keep you inside just a little longer, spending just a little more, and somehow leaving with 17 items when you came in for 3. Let's start with the layout, because the layout is the first trick and it's a good one. Notice where the produce section is in almost every supermarket you've ever visited. At the entrance, near the front. This is not because fruits and vegetables are the most popular items or the most profitable. It's because they are colourful, fresh-smelling and visually abundant, and walking through them at the beginning of a shopping trip puts you in a specific psychological state, optimistic, virtuous, and subtly convinced that because you're going to buy a bag of apples, you've earned whatever else ends up in your cart. The broccoli at the front is doing emotional labour. The dairy and the eggs are at the back, always, in every store. This is intentional. Milk and eggs are staple items that almost everyone buys on almost every trip, and if you need them, you will walk through the entire store to get them. Every aisle you pass on that walk is an opportunity. Every end cap display you encounter is a small ambush. The store is not designed for your convenience. The store is designed for your exposure. Bread is in the middle or the back for the same reason, because the smell of fresh baked bread is one of the most powerful purchase triggers known to retail science. Many supermarkets added in-store bakeries not primarily because customers demanded fresh bread, but because the smell of baking diffuses through the store and makes people hungry, and hungry people buy more food. This is manipulation in the most benign possible sense. Nobody is being harmed by the bread smell, but it is manipulation, and it is working on you right now if you are within range of a bakery, which, based on store design, you probably are. The music was studied too. Slow music makes people move slowly, and people who move slowly through a store buy more. Fast music makes people move quickly and buy less. Supermarkets learned this from a study published in the Journal of Marketing in 1982, and they adjusted accordingly. If the music in your grocery store has always seemed slightly too slow to be anyone's actual preference, that is because it is not designed to be enjoyable. It is designed to be ambient enough to not annoy you, and slow enough to cost you 3 extra minutes per aisle. The end caps, those displays at the end of each aisle, are prime retail real estate, rented by food companies for prices that reflect how reliably they increase sales. Items on end caps sell more, not because they're better or cheaper, but because they are visible. Eye-level shelving works the same way. The products at your eye line are the products that paid to be there. The store brand equivalent that is just as good for $1 less is on the bottom shelf, requiring you to bend down, which feels like effort, which most people would rather not do. The supermarket has correctly guessed that you will pay for the privilege of not crouching. None of this makes grocery shopping bad. It makes it legible. Once you understand that the store is a carefully engineered environment designed to guide your behavior towards specific outcomes, the experience transforms from a neutral errand into something almost admirably intricate. You're walking through a building that has thought harder about your psychology than most people in your life have. The least you can do is notice the bread smell and appreciate the craftsmanship. There is no polite way to explain gelatin salad to a modern person. You have to just say it plainly. At the height of its cultural power, roughly 1950 through 1965, American housewives were suspending vegetables, fruit, and occasionally shrimp inside flavored gelatin and serving it at dinner parties with enormous pride. Lime jello with grated carrots, tomato aspic with olives floating inside like tiny terrified eyes. These were not considered strange. These were considered impressive. And if you want to understand the American relationship with processed food, this is where you have to start. Jello itself was not new. It had been around since 1897, when a man named Pearl Waite trademarked a fruit-flavored gelatin powder, and his wife May named it, and then sold the whole enterprise 2 years later for a mere $450, which history has recorded as one of the more unfortunate business decisions of the 19th century. By the early 1900s, Jell-O was already enormously popular, marketed aggressively through recipe booklets, magazine advertisements, and door-to-door salesmen who handed out free samples to housewives who had not asked for them but were generally polite about it. But the golden age of the molded gelatin dish arrived with the post-war American kitchen, newly equipped with reliable refrigerators, newly stocked with packaged goods, and newly populated with housewives who had time, a desire to impress, and access to women's magazines that published recipes with the editorial voice of cheerful authority. The gelatin mold was ideal for this moment. It required planning. It had to be made ahead and refrigerated, which demonstrated competence. It was visually dramatic, arriving at the table shimmering and intact, holding its improbable shape through what felt like sheer willpower. And it could contain almost anything, which meant it could be adapted endlessly, themed for seasons and holidays, adjusted for budgets and preferences. Cookbooks from this era contain recipes that read, to modern eyes, like fever dreams. Savoury gelatin salads were particularly popular, tomato aspic, chicken suspended in consommé, cream cheese and olive rings, the infamous perfection salad, which won a recipe contest in 1905 and which its creator reportedly considered a significant culinary achievement. It contained cabbage, celery and red peppers in a lemon gelatin base. It was served at nice dinners. People asked for the recipe. The food industry understood what was happening and leaned into it enthusiastically. General Foods, which owned Jell-O, released a steady stream of new flavors and recipe booklets throughout the 50s and 60s, each one suggesting new and increasingly ambitious applications for gelatin. One booklet from 1965 contains a recipe for a tomato-flavored gelatin ring surrounding a tuna salad, filling, which the text describes as a refreshing summer luncheon dish. This is technically accurate. It is also, by any modern measure, a cry for help. The decline was gradual and then sudden. By the 1970s, the moulded gelatin dish had begun its retreat, victim of shifting tastes, increasing food sophistication, and the growing sense among a generation of American women that their mother's cooking had maybe been a little strange. Julia Child had happened. The idea that food should taste like food was gaining ground. The gelatin mold didn't disappear entirely. Jell-O salad persisted in Midwestern church basements and holiday tables long after it vanished from aspirational cooking, but it lost its status, its position at the center of the dinner party table, its claim to being impressive. What it left behind is a useful artifact. The molded gelatin dish tells you exactly what American food culture valued at mid-century: novelty, presentation, control, and the transformative power of a product that could turn a box of powder into something that gleamed. The 1950s housewife's best friend was not her husband, her neighbor, or her therapist. It was her can opener. Canned goods had been around since the Civil War, but by mid-century they had been fully rehabilitated into symbols of modern efficiency and domestic pride. A well-stocked pantry full of Campbell's, Del Monte, and Libby's was proof that you were a capable, prepared, forward-thinking woman. Opening a can was not cheating. Opening a can was science. And combining 4 different cans into a single casserole dish was basically art. Canning had originally been developed in the early 19th century as a military technology. Napoleon famously offered a prize for anyone who could solve the problem of feeding armies in the field, and Nicolas Appert won it in 1810 with a glass jar preservation method that preceded the tin can by only a few years. The early cans were heavy, clunky, and sealed so aggressively that opening them required a hammer and chisel. The instructions on some early cans suggested using a bayonet. This was not a product designed with home cooking in mind. By the 20th century, canned food had evolved considerably. The cans were lighter, the seals were standardized, and the electric can opener, introduced commercially in the 1930s, had transformed the act of opening one from a minor physical challenge into something you could do with one hand while reading a recipe. The food inside had improved too. Campbell's Soup, which had introduced condensed soup in 1897 and printed its first red and white label in 1900, was by the 1950s one of the most recognized brands in the country. Andy Warhol painted those cans in 1962 as a comment on consumer culture, but the housewife who used them did not consider them art. She considered them dinner. The canned goods pantry became a symbol of preparedness that carried an emotional weight beyond the practical. Women in the 50s stocked their pantries the way previous generations had put up preserves, with a sense of security, of providing against uncertainty. A full shelf of canned goods meant you could feed your family regardless of weather, finances, or what was available at the market that week. It was abundance made shelf-stable. The casserole was the highest expression of the canned goods era. The classic green bean casserole, created in 1955 by a Campbell's home economist named Dorcas Riley, required a can of cream of mushroom soup, a can of French-style green beans, and French's fried onions on top. It took about 10 minutes to assemble. It became one of the most made dishes in America within a decade and has never really stopped, appearing on Thanksgiving tables across the country with the kind of stubborn annual consistency that transcends the question of whether anyone actually loves it. The soup can was particularly versatile. Cream of mushroom became a base for everything: sauces, casseroles, gravies, fillings, because it was thick, savoury, shelf-stable, and available in every store in the country. Generations of American cooks learned to cook with it the way previous generations had learned to make roux, not as a shortcut, but as a foundation. The recipe assumed you had a can. The can assumed you were the kind of person who had a recipe. There is something genuinely touching about the canned goods era viewed at distance. It was a period when the American food industry and the American housewife had reached a kind of compact. We will make it easy, and you will make it good. The results were occasionally odd, often comforting, and almost always edible. The can opener was the key to a specific and now largely vanished form of domestic confidence, and the pantry, full and organised, was a quiet declaration. This household is provided for, this family is fed, and I know exactly where the cream of mushroom soup is. The Swanson TV dinner arrived in 1953, packaged in a tray, divided into neat aluminum compartments. Turkey, cornbread dressing, sweet potatoes, peas. It took 25 minutes in the oven. You ate it in front of the television. And in doing so, you quietly, politely, permanently reorganized the American relationship with mealtimes. The TV dinner didn't just feed people, it gave permission. Permission to eat alone, permission to skip the table, permission to prioritize something other than the careful, labor-intensive, socially loaded ritual that every meal had previously been required to be. The origin story of the TV dinner is often told as a happy accident. Swanson had overestimated how much turkey Americans would want after Thanksgiving in 1953, and found itself with a reported 260 tons of surplus frozen turkey and nowhere to put it. A salesman named Jerry Thomas, though his role is debated by food historians, reportedly had the idea to divide the turkey and its accompaniments into individual compartments on an aluminum tray, modelled after the divided plates used on Pan Am flights. Swanson shipped the trays packed in dry ice to test markets, priced them at 98 cents, and called them TV dinners because the television set was, at that precise cultural moment, the most exciting object in the American living room. They sold 98 million of them in the first year. The math on that surplus turkey worked out fine. But the TV dinner's success was about more than convenience. It landed in the middle of a specific cultural moment when the relationship between the American family, the American home, and the American meal was already under pressure. Television had arrived and was reorganizing domestic time around programming schedules. Families who had eaten together at a set hour were now negotiating around broadcast times. The idea of eating in front of the TV, which had been considered somewhat informal, the kind of thing you did when company wasn't coming, was becoming normalized by sheer practice. The TV dinner accelerated this. By making a complete self-contained meal that required no preparation, no serving dishes, no clean-up beyond throwing away a tray, it made eating in front of the television not just acceptable, but logical. The tray even folded out like a little table. Swanson had anticipated your posture. The nutritional content of the original TV dinners was not their strong point. The turkey was often dry, the potatoes were dense, and the peas, subjected to repeated freezing and oven heating, had achieved a texture that is difficult to describe without hand gestures. But this was largely beside the point. The TV dinner was a proposition, not a meal plan, and the proposition was, you don't have to stop what you're doing to eat. Eating can happen alongside other things. Eating does not have to be the main event. This was genuinely revolutionary. The American meal had been, up to this point, formally positioned as a gathering, a moment of family cohesion, of nutritional and social restoration. The dinner table was not just furniture, it was an institution. Etiquette books devoted chapters to it. Magazines ran articles about it. Mothers enforced it with a steady conviction that families who ate together were somehow better, tighter, more intact than those who didn't. The TV dinner said, or alternatively, and enough Americans accepted that alternative to make it one of the best-selling food products of the century. The table didn't disappear, but it was never quite as mandatory again. At some point in American culinary history, a significant shift occurred. Speed stopped being a compromise and became a feature. In the early 20th century, a quick meal was something you apologized for. By the 1960s and 70s, a quick meal was something you bragged about. Convenience food didn't sneak into American kitchens. It was invited in, given a seat at the table, and eventually handed the keys to the whole house. The question wasn't whether fast food was good. The question was why anyone would choose slow when fast was right there, smiling, in a foil pouch. To understand this shift, you have to understand what women's lives actually looked like in the post-war decades. The ideal of the full-time housewife had peaked in the 1950s, but by the 60s and 70s, more women were entering the workforce not always by choice, often by economic necessity, and increasingly because the domestic-only life had been examined, written about, and found wanting by a significant number of the people living it. Women were working. They were also still expected in most households to handle the cooking. The double shift was not a new concept. It was just becoming newly visible and newly exhausting. Into this exhaustion stepped the convenience food industry, which had been studying the problem and had solutions. Hamburger Helper launched in 1971, ground beef, a packet of seasoning, a packet of pasta, and 30 minutes. Betty Crocker's marketing team named it, because you only needed one hand to help. It was not nutritionally sophisticated. It was practically a miracle. By the mid-70s, it was one of the best-selling grocery products in the country, sitting in pantries from suburban New Jersey to rural Montana, offering the same proposition to everyone: dinner without drama. The instant food category expanded rapidly. Instant oatmeal, available since the 40s, found new commercial footing with single-serving packets flavoured with maple syrup and artificial fruit. Instant mashed potatoes, introduced by General Mills in 1965 under the name Potato Buds, invited you to boil water, add powder, and produce something potato-adjacent in under 5 minutes. Ramen noodles, imported from Japan and adapted for American tastes, arrived in the mid-70s and became a staple of college dormitories and budget households with a loyalty that has never wavered. What was happening was not laziness, though it was occasionally described that way, usually by people who were not the ones doing the cooking. What was happening was a rational response to time scarcity. Cooking a meal from scratch takes, on average, somewhere between 30 minutes and several hours, depending on what you're making and how much you've planned ahead. Cooking a convenience meal takes 10 to 20 minutes and requires significantly less cognitive load, no recipe, no multiple components, no timing coordination across multiple pots. When you are tired, when you have already worked 8 hours, when children need attention and laundry is happening and something is beeping from another room, cognitive load is not a trivial consideration. The grocery store reflected this shift in real time, adding shelf space for convenience products, building out the frozen section, dedicating entire aisles to boxed and packaged meal solutions. Speed became a selling point printed on packaging in bold type. Ready in 5 minutes, just add water, dinner on the table in 20. The word easy appeared on food packaging so frequently in this era that it became invisible, a baseline expectation rather than a feature. If it wasn't easy, it was competing at a disadvantage. By the 1980s, easy wasn't enough. It had to be fast too. Nobody announced that speed had won. It just became, gradually, and then completely, the organizing principle of American weeknight eating. a standard so thoroughly internalized that cooking something slowly, something that took hours and required attention, became a hobby, a choice, a thing you did on weekends when you had time. Not dinner. Dinner was the 20-minute version, and the grocery store, stocked wall to wall with the 20-minute version, had made sure you never ran out. Ask an American in 1960 what mayonnaise they used, and watch their eyes light up with the particular fervour usually reserved for sports teams and local grudges. Hellmann's or Miracle Whip, Coke or Pepsi, Duke's or everything else. Brand loyalty in mid-century America was not casual preference. It was identity, inherited from mothers, defended in conversations, and maintained with the kind of stubborn consistency that would make a medieval knight respect you. The grocery store was where these tribal allegiances played out, quietly and weakly, one cart at a time. The psychology behind brand loyalty is not complicated, but it runs deep. Humans are pattern-following creatures who find comfort in repetition, and food is one of the most repetition-dependent areas of life. You ate what your parents ate. Your palate calibrated itself to those specific flavours, the particular sweetness of one brand's ketchup, the specific saltiness of another's crackers, and then spent the rest of your life using that calibration as the definition of correct. Switching brands wasn't just trying something new, it was a minor betrayal of a sensory baseline you'd been building since childhood. The wrong mayonnaise tasted wrong not because it was objectively inferior, but because it wasn't the right one, and the right one was the one you grew up with. The food companies understood this with crystalline clarity and invested heavily in establishing brand identities early and deep. Campbell's Soup began advertising in women's magazines in the early 1900s, building a brand identity so robust that by mid-century the red and white can was one of the most recognized images in the country. Post and Kellogg's competed not just on cereal quality, but on nostalgia. Which brand's box had been on the breakfast table when you were 7? That was the one you'd buy for your own children, and they'd buy for theirs. A loyalty that reproduced itself across generations without requiring any additional marketing. Miracle Whip versus Hellmann's mayonnaise became one of the defining brand rivalries of American grocery culture, a division so firm and emotionally charged that it has functioned, in some families, as a compatibility test for relationships. Miracle Whip, introduced by Kraft in 1933 as a cheaper, sweeter alternative to mayonnaise, became enormously popular in the Midwest and South. Hellmann's, with its cleaner, more traditional flavour profile, dominated the Northeast and the coasts. The two products occupied almost identical shelf space, served almost identical functions, and generated a degree of passionate consumer loyalty that bears no rational relationship to condiment selection. People have opinions about this that they will defend. Supermarkets quietly took advantage of all of this. Store layouts placed competing brands side by side, letting the existing loyalty do the work while house brands appeared nearby, slightly cheaper, slightly less prestigious, waiting for the customer whose loyalty had a price threshold. The rise of the store brand, the generic, the private label, was a long, careful campaign to establish that some people cared about the name on the package, and some people cared about the number on the price tag, and there was money to be made serving both. What's interesting in retrospect is how completely the mid-century brand landscape has fractured. The grocery store that once offered a handful of reliable choices in any given category now offers dozens, each competing for loyalty that is thinner and more conditional than it used to be. The brand relationship that once lasted a lifetime now lasts until something gets a bad review online or the price goes up. The emotional architecture of the mid-century grocery store, built on trust, repetition, and inherited preference, was real and durable and has been quietly, comprehensively dismantled by abundance. You can still find people who will argue for their mayonnaise, But the argument is harder to sustain when there are 19 other options on the same shelf, and 3 of them are locally sourced. By the early 1960s, something was shifting in American kitchens, slowly, uncomfortably, and not without a great deal of resistance. Women who had spent a decade perfecting their jello molds and casserole ratios were starting to read things. Betty Friedan published The Feminine Mystique in 1963, and while it wasn't a cookbook, it had tremendous consequences for the grocery store. The question it raised, "Why is this the whole life?" echoed from the living room into the kitchen, and eventually all the way down the cereal aisle. This is not a straightforward story about feminism liberating women from cooking, because it isn't a story where cooking was simply oppression to be escaped. Many of the women who were asking why in the 1960s genuinely loved to cook. They were skilled at it, proud of it, had built real expertise over years of daily practice. What they were questioning was not the cooking itself, but the frame around it. The idea that cooking was all, that it was the sum of their ambition, the ceiling of their potential, and the primary metric by which they would be evaluated as human beings. The kitchen wasn't the problem. The mandatory nature of it was. Julia Child arrived on American public television in 1963 with a show called The French Chef, and while she was not a feminist in the explicit political sense, she did something quietly radical. She treated cooking as craft, as pleasure, as something worth understanding rather than simply executing. She made mistakes on camera and laughed. She explained why things worked, not just how to do them. She talked about food with intellectual curiosity and physical delight, and did not seem to consider the kitchen a space of obligation. Watching Julia Child cook was, for many American women, the first time they'd seen their daily labour treated as something genuinely interesting. The cookbook market shifted in this decade, where post-war cookbooks had organised themselves around efficiency, practicality, and the reliable performance of domestic duty. 60s cookbooks began allowing for pleasure, exploration, and even difficulty. Mastering the Art of French Cooking, published by Julia Child and her co-authors in 1961, was a 400-page commitment to doing things properly. It assumed the reader wanted to understand. It assumed the reader had time, interest, and the willingness to make a beurre blanc. This was not the same assumption that had been built into the casserole era. Meanwhile, the grocery store was changing in response to pressure that was partly demographic and partly political. More women working meant a different shopping profile, less time, different priorities, more interest in convenience, but also, among the college-educated demographic that was growing rapidly, more interest in quality. Specialty items began appearing on shelves that would not have been there in 1955. Imported cheeses, olive oils that were not from a blend, wines sold not in jugs but in bottles. The idea that a grocery store should carry things beyond the American mainstream was new, and its arrival was a quiet acknowledgement that the shopper's expectations were diversifying. At the same time, the school lunch programs, the food stamps debates, and the early environmental movement were beginning to introduce questions about where food came from and what it contained. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962 was primarily about pesticides and ecology, but it planted a seed of consumer skepticism about industrial food production that would grow considerably in the following decades. If chemical companies were doing things to the environment, what were they doing to the food? The question didn't have immediate commercial consequences, but it was being asked, and asking, it was enough. The 1960s kitchen was a room in transition, still largely the woman's room, still defined by its traditional function, but increasingly inhabited by women who were thinking about it differently, as a place of skill and pleasure on their own terms, not merely as the location where domestic obligation was discharged. The grocery store at the end of that decade looked almost identical to the one at the beginning. But the person pushing the cart had changed. The 1970s were not kind to American cuisine. They were the decade of Tang and Hamburger Helper, of fondue sets and frozen pot pies, of casseroles made with cream of mushroom soup that had been in the back of the pantry since the Johnson administration. They were also the decade of the first great national nutritional panic, when Americans discovered that fat was killing them, then that sugar was killing them, then that they didn't actually know what was killing them, but they were very upset about it. The result was a decade of food that was somehow both excessive and apologetic, rich and chemical, ambitious and deeply, profoundly beige. To be fair to the 1970s, some of what they did to food was enthusiastic rather than destructive. The decade had a genuine interest in entertaining, in dinner parties, in the drama of presenting food to guests. Fondue had arrived from Switzerland in the late 60s and hit its cultural peak in the early 70s. Not just cheese fondue, but oil fondue, chocolate fondue, any. Fondue, really, the vessel itself having become a symbol of sophisticated sociality. The crock-pot arrived in 1971, promising that you could start dinner in the morning, go about your day, and return in the evening to something that had been slowly cooking without supervision. This was considered remarkable, but the shadow side of 70s food culture was the industrial system that was supplying it. The 1970s saw the full maturation of a food production model that had been building since the end of the war, hyper-processed, chemically stabilized, engineered for shelf life and uniform flavor, rather than nutrition or taste. The TV dinner had given way to an entire category of convenience products that increasingly bore only a theoretical resemblance to their original ingredients. Cheese that didn't require refrigeration, bread that lasted 2 weeks without going stale, orange-flavoured powder that the government had sent into space and was now available in your grocery store, framed as an achievement. The oil crisis of 1973 had upstream effects on food prices that made cheap, filling, processed food more attractive and fresh, produced less accessible for many households. Inflation ran through the decade and hit grocery bills hard. The response was practical and understandable. You bought what was affordable, and what was affordable was largely the shelf-stable, industrialized middle of the store. Then, in 1977, the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs published dietary guidelines that linked fat and cholesterol to heart disease, and American food culture shifted on its axis. The guidelines were imperfect. They oversimplified a genuinely complex nutritional picture, and the food industry would spend the next 2 decades manipulating the resulting panic for profit, but they planted a specific and lasting anxiety about fat that would define eating behavior for decades. Fat was now dangerous. Fat was something to be reduced, removed, replaced. The grocery store responded immediately because this is what grocery stores do. They respond to stated consumer anxiety with new products. Low-fat options appeared. Reduced fat labels multiplied. Margarine, which had been marketed as healthier than butter since its introduction, received a significant boost. That margarine turned out to contain trans fats that were considerably worse for cardiovascular health than the butter it replaced would not be widely understood for another 20 years. This was not the last time the food industry would solve a nutritional problem by creating a different one. The 1970s also gave America the salad bar, introduced by a chain called Soup Plantation in San Diego in 1971, and spreading rapidly through chain restaurants and eventually supermarkets, which was the decade's most sincere attempt at fresh, unprocessed food, and which was immediately improved with croutons, shredded imitation bacon bits, and a ladle of ranch dressing that made the vegetable content technically irrelevant. The decade tried. It just tried while also buying a case of Hamburger Helper and a fondue pot, and the results were exactly what you'd expect. Walk down the cereal aisle in any American supermarket in the 1970s, and you were not shopping. You were entering a negotiation with your children, a gauntlet of cartoon characters and sugar content, and the distinct possibility that the toy inside the box was the actual reason anyone wanted breakfast in the first place. Breakfast cereal had started in the late 19th century as a health food, practically medicinal, almost punitive. By 1978, it was a delivery mechanism for marshmallows shaped like moons and stars, and nobody had noticed the journey was a little strange. The origin of breakfast cereal is one of the more unusual chapters in American food history, because it begins not in a test kitchen or a boardroom, but in a sanitarium. John Harvey Kellogg was a physician and health reformer running the Battle Creek Sanitarium in Michigan in the 1880s, where he treated patients with a regimen of exercise, fresh air, and a diet so aggressively bland that it was essentially a punishment for having a digestive system. Kellogg believed that meat, spice, and flavorful food stimulated dangerous impulses, moral as well as physical, and that a diet of simple grains would calm the body and improve the character. His cornflakes were not designed to be enjoyable, they were designed to be corrective. His brother Will, who had better commercial instincts and fewer theories about the moral consequences of breakfast, broke away from John, added sugar to the cornflakes recipe, and built a business that would eventually become the Kellogg Company. C.W. Post, a former patient at the sanitarium who had absorbed the health food philosophy and then immediately figured out how to market it, launched Grape Nuts in 1898 and Post Toasties shortly after. By the early 20th century, Battle Creek, Michigan had become the cereal capital of the world, with dozens of companies producing grain-based breakfast products and advertising them with the health-forward language of the era. Cereal was good for you. Cereal was modern. Cereal was what sensible people ate. Then came the sugar. The transition from health food to confection happened gradually through the 30s and 40s, accelerated dramatically after the war, and achieved full delirium in the 1960s and 70s. Sugar Smacks launched in 1953 with a sugar content of 56%, which means it was more than half sugar by weight, and was still somehow being sold as breakfast. Fruit Loops arrived in 1963. Lucky Charms, with its revolutionary addition of marshmallow pieces to an oat cereal, launched in 1964. The marshmallows were called Marbits internally by General Mills, a word that exists only in the context of children's cereal, and which nobody has ever said aloud without feeling slightly embarrassed. The mascots were the stroke of genius that locked children in for generations. Tony the Tiger for Frosted Flakes, Toucan Sam for Fruit Loops, the Trix Rabbit, perpetually denied the cereal by children who had apparently developed a territorial instinct about their breakfast. Cap'n Crunch, who arrived in 1963 with a cereal so texturally aggressive that it reliably lacerated the roof of your mouth and continued selling extremely well regardless. These characters were not just marketing. They were companions, familiar and consistent, showing up on the kitchen table every morning with the dependable cheerfulness of a friend who has never once been in a bad mood and also has a prize inside their hat. The toy inside the box was, in retrospect, an extraordinary escalation. Cracker Jack had been putting prizes in packages since 1912, but the cereal industry adopted the practice with particular enthusiasm in the 50s and 60s, inserting toys, games, records and collectibles into boxes as a direct financial incentive for children to demand specific products. The toy was frequently better than the cereal. The toy was sometimes the only reason the cereal was purchased. Parents understood what was happening and bought it anyway, because the alternative was a negotiation they didn't have energy for at 7 in the morning. By the 1980s, the cereal aisle had become the most psychologically sophisticated section of the grocery store. Products placed at child eye level, boxes designed with bright colours and dynamic characters that made calm, rational decision-making nearly impossible for anyone under 12. The health claims that had launched the industry a century earlier were still there, printed in small type near the bottom of the box, technically accurate, easily ignored. Above them, in large type, a cartoon bird was promising you that breakfast could be an adventure, and that somehow is what won. In the early days of the supermarket, the frozen food section was small, modest, and mostly limited to vegetables and ice cream. Then, somewhere around the 1960s and 70s, American food scientists had a realization that was either visionary or deeply concerning depending on your perspective. Almost anything could be frozen, thawed, and technically eaten. By the 1980s, the frozen aisle had expanded to include complete dinners, breakfast burritos, stuffed peppers, fish sticks, pizza rolls, and a dizzying array of products that posed the quiet philosophical question, is this food, or is this the idea of food? The man most responsible for making frozen food commercially viable was Clarence Birdseye, who had observed indigenous people in Labrador freezing fish in the 1910s and realized that the key to quality frozen food was speed. Freeze it fast enough, and the ice crystals that form are small enough not to rupture cell walls, meaning the food retains its texture and flavor upon thawing. He developed a commercial flash freezing process, sold the patents to General Foods in 1929 for $22 million, and spent the rest of his life inventing other things, including an infrared heat lamp and a method for converting sugarcane waste into paper. Birdseye was the kind of person who simply could not stop solving problems, which the world should be grateful for even if the frozen burritos are mixed legacy. The early frozen food section was limited by what technology could handle and what consumers were willing to accept. Frozen vegetables were the first big success. Peas, corn, and green beans that could be stored indefinitely and cooked in minutes. A genuine improvement over canned versions that had been boiled into submission. Frozen orange juice concentrate, introduced in 1945, was revolutionary. Fresh-tasting juice, year-round, from a can in the freezer. Birdseye and Minute Maid built entire businesses on these single products. But the real expansion came in the 60s and 70s, when the combination of a microwave oven availability, women entering the workforce, and aggressive food industry investment in convenience products pushed the frozen section into genuinely ambitious territory. The frozen pizza arrived, initially terrible and gradually less so. Frozen lasagna, frozen enchiladas, frozen pot pies with crusts that were either delicious or structurally problematic depending on your oven. Marie Callender's entered the frozen meal category in 1975, bringing a level of ambition, multiple components, sauces, side dishes that made previous frozen meals look apologetic by comparison. The pizza roll deserves its own moment. Introduced by Geno Paolucci under the name Geno's Pizza Rolls in 1968, these small pockets of tomato sauce and cheese encased in a dough that emerged from the oven at a temperature apparently borrowed from industrial applications became one of the most beloved frozen products in American history. They were not good for you. They were not sophisticated. They required you to wait several minutes after removing them from the oven, or risk burning the roof of your mouth so severely that you would remember it for years, a risk that approximately nobody learned from the first time. They were eaten in enormous quantities by children and adults who should have known better and felt no remorse whatsoever. The frozen aisle's expansion reflected something genuine about the American appetite for convenience, but also something genuine about American optimism about technology. If freezing could preserve corn and orange juice, surely it could preserve anything. Surely there was no culinary application that could not be improved by transformation into a product that lived in your freezer until you needed it. The results were uneven. Some frozen foods were excellent, some were the culinary equivalent of a broken promise, but the ambition was consistent. America believed in the frozen aisle the way it believed in other technological solutions, thoroughly, enthusiastically, and slightly ahead of the evidence. By the 1990s, the frozen section occupied more floor space than almost any other department in the store, a cathedral of glass doors and humming refrigeration units containing multitudes. You could eat every meal from the frozen aisle for weeks without repeating yourself, a fact that was either liberating or faintly dystopian depending on what you thought food was supposed to be. The aisle had won. And somewhere, Clarence Birdseye, who had simply wanted to freeze fish properly, was presumably at peace with this. Somewhere around 1982, America collectively looked at its plate, panicked, and rearranged everything. Oat bran became a household obsession. Fat-free became a moral category. Aerobics was happening in strip malls across the nation, and the grocery store responded by filling an entirely new section with products that were technically edible, but had removed whatever had originally made them enjoyable. Fat-free cookies, no-fat salad dressing that tasted like cold regret, reduced sodium everything. The grocery store had discovered that Americans would pay a premium for food that had been made slightly worse for them. The panic had been building since the late 70s, when the Senate dietary guidelines had identified fat and cholesterol as the primary dietary villains. But it reached full cultural saturation in the early 80s for a specific and somewhat ironic reason: the fitness boom. Jane Fonda's Workout, released as a VHS tape in 1982, sold 17 million copies and convinced an entire generation of Americans that they were going to get serious about their bodies. Aerobics classes proliferated. Running became a lifestyle. Gym membership, previously a niche activity for bodybuilders and athletes, became something that ordinary suburban adults did, or at least paid for. With this newfound physical self-consciousness came heightened awareness of what was going in the mouth, and what was going in the mouth suddenly seemed worth worrying about. The food industry's response was swift, profitable, and not entirely honest. The mandate from consumers was clear: less fat. The industry's interpretation was creative: remove the fat, replace it with sugar, starch, or chemical emulsifiers that replicated fat's textural function, and label the result healthy. Snackwell's cookies, launched by Nabisco in 1992, became the defining product of this era. Fat-free chocolate sandwich cookies that were so aggressively marketed as a health food that consumers ate them in quantities that fully negated any caloric benefit. The Snackwell's effect, as it became known in behavioral nutrition research, described the phenomenon of people eating more of something because it was labelled low-fat, ultimately consuming more calories than they would have from the original product. The cookies were not innocent bystanders in this. They were extremely good at being cookies, and people ate the whole box. Oat bran had its specific cultural moment in 1988, following a study that suggested it could reduce cholesterol, which was now understood as connected to heart disease, which was the thing everyone was afraid of. Within months, oat bran had been added to everything: muffins, cereals, bread, crackers, and products that had no natural relationship to oats and were essentially using the ingredient as a label claim. Restaurants added oat bran muffins to their menus. Supermarkets built dedicated oat bran displays. A study published the following year suggested the effect had been overstated and the frenzy subsided. But for approximately 18 months, oat bran was treated with the reverence usually reserved for religious objects. Sodium became a separate anxiety running alongside the fat panic, driven by research connecting high sodium intake to hypertension. The reduced sodium label appeared across the store, on products where the original sodium content had been entirely normal, and where the reduced version tasted noticeably worse, but carried the comfort of the claim. Consumers bought it. The premium was real. Lower sodium products often cost more than their regular equivalents, a pricing strategy that required considerable confidence in the consumer's anxiety, and it was paid without much complaint. What the 1980s health food panic produced in the end was not a healthier American diet. Obesity rates continued to rise through the decade and accelerated in the 90s. What it produced was a new and durable layer of nutritional anxiety, a grocery shopping experience haunted by labels and claims, and the persistent sense that the correct choice was always one more piece of information away. The store had gotten more complicated, the shopper had gotten more confused, and the food industry, which had created both the complexity and the confusion, was doing extremely well. In the 1980s, a new type of grocery shopper emerged, the urban professional, freshly arrived at disposable income, with strong opinions about olive oil. Where their parents had bought French's yellow mustard without a second thought, the yuppie shopper stood in front of an imported Dijon and felt a quiet swell of self-determination. Specialty food sections expanded. Balsamic vinegar appeared. Someone started selling sun-dried tomatoes at a price that suggested they'd been individually dried by artisans in Tuscany, which was possibly true and definitely successful. Food had become taste, and taste had become class. The word yuppie, young urban professional, entered the American vocabulary around 1982 and was used both aspirationally and as a mild insult depending on who was using it. The yuppie was defined partly by income and partly by consumption patterns. They drove a certain kind of car, wore a certain kind of running shoe, and ate a certain kind of food. The food part was particularly legible because it was visible in a way that most other preferences weren't. What you ate at a dinner party or kept in your kitchen told people something about who you were, where you'd been, and what kind of person you considered yourself to be. For the yuppie, the answer to all three was sophisticated, worldly, and not remotely interested in French's yellow mustard. Whole grains and artisan bread began appearing in stores that had previously offered only white sandwich bread and perhaps a rye. Sun-dried tomatoes, which Italian home cooks had been making for centuries from surplus summer tomatoes, arrived in American specialty stores in the early 80s packed in olive oil at prices that implied scarcity. They were not scarce. They were a drying technique available to anyone with tomatoes and sunlight. But in the American specialty grocery context, they were exotic, and exotic was worth paying for. Balsamic vinegar from Medina, aged for years in wooden barrels, with a complex sweetness entirely unlike ordinary wine vinegar, entered the American pantry and did not leave. It was followed by extra virgin olive oil, pesto, capers and anchovies, products that had been standard in Italian kitchens for generations and were now being discovered by Americans who treated them with the reverent enthusiasm of explorers. Williams-Sonoma, which had been selling French cookware since the 1950s, became a cultural touchstone of the yuppie food moment, a store where you could buy a copper sauté pan, a pasta machine, and a bottle of truffle oil, all of which suggested you were the kind of person who cooked with intention. The cooking wasn't always the point. The equipment was a signal, the pantry a portrait. Having the right ingredients in your kitchen meant something about what kind of life you were living, what kind of person you aspired to be. The food was doing identity work that food had not previously been asked to do at this level of specificity. The supermarket responded by creating specialty sections, areas near the deli or the cheese counter, where imported and artisan products clustered, separated from the regular store by an implicit price point and an atmosphere of mild exclusivity. These sections grew through the 80s as the market for specialty food expanded, and the products within them became gradually more mainstream. Dijon mustard, which had been a specialty item in 1980, was a standard pantry staple by 1995. Balsamic vinegar, which had required a specialty store in the early 80s, appeared on the regular shelf alongside white vinegar by the mid-90s. The specialty section's job was always to be slightly ahead, offering the next thing that would eventually become normal. What the Yuppie pantry established, and what has not been dismantled since, is the idea that food choices are character choices, that what you buy at the grocery store says something meaningful about who you are, what you value, and how seriously you take the business of eating. This idea has proliferated and deepened in the decades since, producing a food culture of considerable complexity and occasional absurdity. But it started improbably with a jar of imported mustard on a shelf in 1983, and someone picking it up instead of the yellow one and feeling, briefly but genuinely, like a more interesting version of themselves. When Costco opened and Sam's Club expanded in the 1980s, something happened to the American psyche that there is genuinely no recovering from. The warehouse store offered a simple and devastatingly effective proposition. Why buy one when you can buy 48 for slightly less per unit? Suddenly Americans were purchasing mayonnaise in containers the size of small children, toilet paper in quantities that implied a deep anxiety about the future, and muffins the size of human heads, at a price that made refusing feel almost irresponsible. Abundance had always been the American promise. The warehouse store made it a square footage problem. The warehouse club model had a specific origin. Saul Price, a San Diego retailer who opened the first Price Club in 1976 in a converted airplane hangar, targeting small business owners who wanted to buy in bulk at wholesale prices. The membership fee was the key innovation. By charging customers for access, Price created a self-selecting audience of serious buyers who were motivated to shop frequently enough to justify the annual cost. The stores were deliberately Spartan. Concrete floors, metal shelving, products displayed in their shipping boxes, no decorative investment of any kind. The absence of atmosphere was itself the message. We're not spending money on making this pleasant, and we are passing those savings directly to you in the form of a 48-pack of granola bars. James Sinegal, who had worked with Price, co-founded Costco in 1983 in Seattle. Sam Walton opened Sam's Club the same year. The format proved almost impossibly attractive to American consumers, and the reasons go deeper than simple price savings. The warehouse store tapped into something primal about the relationship between Americans and abundance, a cultural appetite for more that had been running since the first supermarkets opened their doors and promised everything in one place. The warehouse store said, "And what if we meant that?" The scale of everything inside was the experience itself. Products at Costco were not simply large. They were large in a way that redefined your sense of what quantity was normal. A jar of peanut butter the size of a paint can, a package of chicken breasts that required 2 hands to carry, a flat of canned tomatoes that would supply a restaurant for a week, and a household for what felt like a geological epoch. Standing in front of these things produced a specific sensation, a mixture of satisfaction, slight alarm, and the quiet conviction that you were getting away with something that regular grocery stores simply couldn't replicate. The rotisserie chicken became Costco's most iconic product. A whole roasted chicken, available near the exit, priced at $4.99 since at least 2009 and reportedly sold at a loss because Costco had correctly identified it as a traffic driver that brought people to the back of the store and generated goodwill disproportionate to its margin. The Costco rotisserie chicken is not simply a chicken. It is a cultural artifact, a loyalty mechanism, a proof of concept that warehouse retail understood something about American desire that ordinary grocery stores were slower to grasp. The psychological dynamic of the warehouse store is worth examining because it is quite specific. The membership fee creates a sunk cost motivation. You have paid to be here, so you should buy things to justify having paid. The scale of the products creates an anchoring effect. A 48-pack of water seems reasonably priced relative to a 24-pack, at twice the per unit cost, even if you have nowhere to store 48 bottles of water. The treasure hunt element, particularly at Costco with its rotating selection of non-grocery items, electronics, clothing, furniture, books, occasionally a kayak, creates a browsing experience with the stakes of discovery, where you might find something extraordinary or might find nothing, but you will definitely find something you didn't know you needed. The warehouse store did not replace the supermarket. It occupied a different space in the shopping week, the big trip, the restocking mission, the expedition rather than the errand. But it permanently altered the baseline expectation of what value at the grocery store meant, and it made a certain scale of abundance not just available but normal. The 48-pack was no longer extravagant. It was simply Tuesday. The microwave oven had been commercially available since the 1950s, but it took until the early 1980s for it to truly colonize the American kitchen, and with it came an entirely new category of product, the frozen entree designed specifically for microwave preparation. Lean cuisine launched in 1981. Healthy choice followed. The pitch was elegant. A complete meal, portion-controlled, nutritionally balanced, requiring only 4 minutes, and the ability to remove the plastic film from a corner before cooking. This was not a compromise. This was evolution. This was the future, and the future smelled like steamed broccoli and mild disappointment. The microwave's origin is another happy accident of American technological history. Percy Spencer, an engineer at Raytheon, was working with radar equipment in 1945 when he noticed that a chocolate bar in his pocket had melted while he was standing near a magnetron, the device that generates the microwave radiation used in radar systems. He was curious rather than alarmed, which says something about the particular temperament required to work in industrial engineering in the 1940s. He experimented with popcorn, then an egg, which exploded, and then filed a patent for a cooking device using microwave radiation. The first commercial microwave oven, called the Radarange, was introduced in 1947. It was 6 feet tall, weighed 750 pounds, and cost $5,000. It was installed primarily in restaurants and institutional kitchens. It was not making its way into anyone's home. The countertop microwave arrived in the early 70s, still expensive but gradually more affordable, and by the early 80s had achieved the kind of market penetration that made food companies pay attention. If most American kitchens contained a microwave, then products designed specifically for microwave cooking were not a niche. They were a category. Stouffer's, which had been making frozen meals since the 60s, repositioned for the microwave era. Lean Cuisine launched as a Stouffer's sub-brand in 1981 with the dual promise of convenience and calorie control. Most meals came in under 300 calories, found an audience immediately among working women who needed lunch at their desks and dieters who wanted portion control without preparation. The portion control element was central and deliberate. The Lean Cuisine tray was small. The contents were measured. You did not have to decide how much to eat because the package had decided for you, and this removed a cognitive task that many people found genuinely difficult. The fact that the portion was also quite small, a fact that early consumer occasionally addressed by eating two, was secondary to the relief of having the decision made. Food companies had correctly identified that what many people wanted was not just convenience but structure. A meal that told you what it was and how much of it there was and how long it would take, and then delivered on those terms without asking anything further of you. The microwave changed the relationship between cooking and time in ways that previous convenience products hadn't quite managed. The TV dinner had taken 25 minutes in the oven. The microwave meal took 4. 4 minutes was so close to immediate that the intervening time barely registered as waiting. You pressed buttons, you turned away, a noise happened, the food was ready. The process was so compressed that it ceased to feel like cooking at all, and became something more like retrieval. You retrieved your meal from the appliance the way you retrieved ice from the freezer, a transaction rather than a preparation. What was lost in this transaction is worth acknowledging. The act of preparing food, measuring, cutting, combining, monitoring, adjusting, is also a form of decompression, a physical activity that occupies the hands and redirects the mind. Cooking from scratch is often the thing that people who do it miss when they stop, not the result but the process. The microwave meal removed the process entirely and replaced it with beeping, and beeping, whatever its virtues, is not therapeutic. The meal that emerged was hot, edible, and exactly 4 minutes away from the hunger that preceded it. What it was not was an experience, and the slow erosion of the meal as an experience, as something that took time and produced pleasure through more than just eating, is one of the longer-running consequences of the microwave revolution. The 4-minute dinner was fast. Whether it was better was a question the packaging didn't address. When the first Whole Foods market opened in Austin, Texas in 1980, it was not immediately clear that it would eventually redefine American grocery culture. The meaning of the word organic, and the going rate for a bottle of cold-pressed juice. But it did. Whole Foods, and the natural food movement it helped popularize, introduced a new set of values into the grocery store. Provenance, ingredient transparency, the idea that food could be clean, a word that had previously applied to dishes and floors but now applied to your shopping cart, your body, and by quiet implication, your soul. The natural food movement that preceded Whole Foods had been percolating since the late 1960s, driven by the same counterculture energy that questioned industrial agriculture, chemical additives, and the general direction of American food production. The first natural food co-ops, member-owned stores that stocked whole grains, organic produce, and products without artificial additives, appeared in college towns and urban neighborhoods in the early 70s, serving a community of consumers who had read Diet for a Small Planet, knew what carrageenan was, and would rather grind their own peanut butter than buy Jif. These stores were earnest, slightly austere, and frequently located in spaces that were not designed to be retail environments. The ideology was sound, but the shopping experience was not aspirational. John Mackey, who co-founded Whole Foods at 25 with his girlfriend and 2 other partners in a converted Victorian house in Austin, understood that the product line of the natural food co-op could be delivered in an environment that didn't feel like a homework assignment. The first Whole Foods was larger than any natural food store that had preceded it, well lit, well organized, and staffed by people who seemed genuinely interested in what they were selling. It looked like a real supermarket, which it was, except that everything in it had been selected according to a set of standards about ingredients, sourcing, and production methods that the conventional supermarket had never applied. The growth was slow at first and then, through the 1990s, dramatic. Whole Foods expanded by acquisition and new openings, entering major markets and bringing the natural food concept to consumers who had never sought it out but found, once they encountered it, that they preferred it. The stores were expensive, the nickname whole paycheck arrived early and stuck firmly, but the experience justified a premium for a specific kind of shopper, one who had disposable income, concerns about industrial food production, and an appetite for the brand promise that what they were buying was better. Better for them. Better for the environment, better in a way that the regular grocery store, with its conventional produce and its ingredient list that required a chemistry degree to pass, was not. The organic label was the engine of this. Certified organic, regulated by the USDA from 2002 onward, became a shorthand for clean in the consumer vocabulary, meaning free from synthetic pesticides, free from GMOs, produced according to standards that reflected at least some concern for ecological impact. The organic premium was real and significant. organic produce typically cost 30 to 50% more than conventional, a gap that the market absorbed without much resistance among the demographic shopping at Whole Foods. The question of whether organic food was nutritionally superior to conventional was complicated and contested. The question of whether it felt better to buy was not complicated at all. It felt considerably better, and feeling was doing most of the work. Whole Foods changed the conventional grocery store by existing. Supermarket chains that had ignored the natural food market through the 80s began adding organic sections in the 90s. By the 2000s, Walmart was selling organic produce. The values that Whole Foods had introduced, transparency, ingredient quality, sourcing accountability, had migrated from the specialty retailer into the mainstream at a speed that no one in the natural food co-op movement of the 1970s had anticipated. The clean food idea had won, or at least won enough to be available at most major supermarkets, usually in a section near the health food aisle, where the prices were higher and the packaging was green, and the implicit message was, this is what good looks like, if you can afford it. The 1990s were, among other things, the golden age of the snack. Not the modest between-meal nibble of previous decades, an apple, a handful of crackers, the kind of snack that acknowledged its own smallness. The 90s snack was ambitious, shelf-stable, engineered for maximum flavor impact, and available in a bag large enough to function as a small pillow. Gushers, Dunkaroos, Lunchables, cosmic brownies, string cheese in quantities previously reserved for dairy farmers. The American food industry had discovered that if you gave a snack a fun name and a cartoon mascot, people would eat it regardless of whether they were hungry, and this discovery proved to be financially inexhaustible. The snack food category had existed for decades before the 90s, potato chips since the 1850s, pretzels since colonial times, Fritos since 1932, but the 90s represented a qualitative shift in both the ambition of snack products and the cultural permission to eat them constantly. 3 meals a day had been the structural norm for most of American food history, with snacks occupying a supplementary, slightly apologetic position. The 90s dismantled this architecture quietly and completely. Grazing, eating small amounts frequently throughout the day rather than at set meal times, was introduced as a nutritional concept in fitness and diet circles, and rapidly adopted as a lifestyle by people who had no interest in its nutritional rationale, and simply found it convenient and enjoyable to eat things whenever they wanted. The food industry met this shift with what can only be described as enthusiasm. The Lunchable, introduced by Oscar Mayer in 1988 and achieving full cultural saturation in the early 90s, was not technically a snack. It was marketed as a lunch, but it embodied the snack philosophy completely. A self-contained, individually portioned combination of small foods, requiring no preparation, no utensils, and no one's involvement but the person eating it. Children loved Lunchables because they were fun and required no adult participation. Parents bought Lunchables because they were easy. The fact that the nutritional content was modest and the sodium content was aggressive was noted by pediatricians and largely ignored by everyone else, because the child was eating something and not asking anyone for help with it. Gushers arrived in 1991 and presented a novel sensory proposition, a gummy snack with liquid fruit filling inside so that biting into one produced a small burst of aggressively sweet juice. They were immediately popular with children and viewed with mild horror by parents who'd been splashed. Dunkaroos, launched the same year in Canada and reaching the American market shortly after, offered cookie animals you could dip into a small container of frosting, a snack so transparently dessert formatted that it is remarkable they were sold as a lunchbox item with apparent sincerity. The flavour engineering of 90s snacks deserves its own acknowledgement, because because it was genuinely sophisticated in ways that were not immediately obvious. The combination of salt, fat and sugar in specific ratios produces what food scientists call hyperpalatability, a food experience so calibrated to human sensory preferences that it bypasses normal satiety signals and encourages continued eating past the point of hunger. This was not accidental. Food companies employed flavor chemists, conducted extensive consumer testing, and iterated products until they hit the combination that produced the least resistance to continued consumption. The technical term for this, coined by researcher Howard Moskowitz, was the bliss point. The 90s snack industry had found the bliss point and was manufacturing directly to it with increasing precision. The snack aisle grew. The snack section expanded. Products proliferated at a rate that made the cereal aisle look restrained. By the late 90s, the average supermarket stocked hundreds of distinct snack products, each one occupying shelf space that had been carefully purchased, positioned at heights calibrated to different audiences, and designed with packaging optimized to be noticed in peripheral vision. The American snack had become an industry of extraordinary sophistication, devoted entirely to the proposition that there was no moment of the day that could not be improved by eating something that came in a crinkly bag. This proposition proved correct, commercially speaking, and has not been seriously challenged since. In 1994, the Nutrition Labeling and Education Act went into full effect, requiring standardized nutrition fact panels on nearly all packaged foods. Suddenly, there they were: calories, fat grams, sodium, serving sizes that bore a complicated relationship with reality. The American grocery shopper was now armed with information. What they did with that information varied considerably. Some became meticulous label readers, comparing products with the focused intensity of forensic accountants. Others glanced at the panel, saw a number that seemed manageable, decided that 2 servings was basically 1 serving, and moved on with their lives. The push for mandatory nutrition labeling had been building for decades. The FDA had required ingredient labeling since the 1930s, meaning products had to list what they contained in descending order by weight. But calorie counts and nutrient breakdowns were voluntary for most products until the 1990s, meaning that unless a company specifically chose to include them, usually because the information was flattering, the consumer had no standardized way to understand what they were eating in nutritional terms. You knew what was in the food, you didn't know how much of anything it contained or what that meant for your health. The process of developing the standardized nutrition fact panel was neither quick nor simple. The FDA solicited public comment, conducted consumer research, argued with the food industry over definitions and serving sizes, and produced a final format that balanced comprehensiveness with readability. The panel that emerged: white background, black text, bold headers for calories and the most nutritionally significant items, complete list of macronutrients and selected micronutrients, was a genuine design achievement, though the serving size line at the top would become its most contentious element almost immediately. The serving size problem was this: the FDA required that serving sizes reflect amounts people typically consumed, but food companies had significant latitude in defining what typical meant. A serving of chips was typically defined as about an ounce, or roughly 12 to 15 chips, which was the amount that appeared to have been selected because it produced a calorie number that was not alarming. Nobody has ever eaten 12 chips. The bag does not contain 1 serving. Everyone knows the bag does not contain 1 serving. The serving size on the nutrition panel and the serving sizes actually consumed existed in 2 separate realities that maintained polite awareness of each other without ever making direct contact. Despite this tension, the nutrition label produced genuine behavioral change among certain consumer segments. People with specific health conditions, diabetes, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, used the information directly and meaningfully. parents consulting labels for their children's foods made decisions informed by the sodium and sugar numbers in ways they hadn't been able to before. The diet and weight loss market, already enormous, now had a standardized numerical language that allowed calorie counting to become a more precise and widely practiced activity. The label also changed the grocery store in a subtler way. It made the health claims on the front of the package checkable. A product that said heart healthy or low fat on the front panel could now be evaluated against the actual numbers on the back. This did not stop companies from making misleading front-of-package claims, but it gave consumers a tool for skepticism that they hadn't had before. The label was a small structural challenge to the food industry's marketing apparatus, not sufficient to overcome it, but real enough to require adaptation. Products reformulated to improve their label numbers. Serving sizes were engineered. The front of the package and the back of the package entered a quiet negotiation that continues today, each one trying to tell a different story about the same food, and the consumer standing in the aisle deciding which story to believe. By the late 1990s and into the 2000s, something interesting was happening on Saturday mornings in American cities. People were waking up early, voluntarily, to stand in an outdoor market and pay considerably more than supermarket prices for vegetables grown within a reasonable drive of where they were standing. The farmer's market wasn't a new concept. It was, in fact, how food had been sold for most of human history. But its return was freighted with new meaning, authenticity, community, the quiet satisfaction of handing money directly to a person in a weathered hat who grew the actual tomatoes you were holding. It was shopping as ethics. It was lettuce as a value statement. The farmer's market had never fully disappeared in America. Rural areas and smaller. Towns had maintained them with quiet consistency throughout the decades when the supermarket dominated urban food culture. But the urban farmers' market revival of the late 90s was something different in character. A deliberate, values-laden return to direct food purchasing by a demographic that had grown up with supermarkets and was now, in its 30s and 40s, questioning what that system had cost. The USDA counted approximately 1,700 farmers' markets in the country in 1994. By 2014, there were over 8,000. That is not a trend. That is a movement. The timing was not coincidental. The 90s had brought the first wave of industrial food exposés into mainstream consciousness. Eric Schlosser's Fast Food Nation would arrive in 2001, but its precursors, investigative journalism about factory farming, food safety scandals, the growing literature on agricultural consolidation had been accumulating through the late 90s and finding audiences who were ready to be troubled. The E. coli outbreak linked to Jack in the Box in 1993, which killed 4 children and sickened hundreds, had introduced the concept of industrial food contamination to people who had never thought about where their hamburger came from. Thinking about it produced feelings that the farmer's market was specifically designed to address. The farmer's market offered a counter-narrative to every anxiety the industrial food system generated. Where the supermarket offered abundance but opacity, you could buy a tomato in January but had no idea where it had come from, how long ago it had been picked, or what had been done to it in the interim. The farmer's market offered visibility. You could ask the person selling you the tomato when it was picked, because that person was standing right there. This was not just practically useful. It was emotionally satisfying in a way that addressed something the supermarket, for all its engineered pleasures, could not. The premium was real and significant, and it sorted the farmer's market audience in ways that the movement's more idealistic participants found uncomfortable to acknowledge. Heirloom tomatoes at $4 a pound, pasture-raised eggs at $7 a dozen, artisan bread at $9 a loaf. These prices were not accessible to everyone, and the demographics of the typical urban farmer's market, predominantly white and predominantly middle to upper income, reflected the access gap clearly. The argument that local and sustainable food should be available to everyone was made frequently and sincerely. The structural conditions that made it expensive were slower to change than the sentiment about changing them. What the farmers' market did achieve, beyond its immediate audience, was a change in the vocabulary of food retail. Terms that had been marginal, local, seasonal, heirloom, pasture-raised, small batch, entered mainstream food marketing through the farmers' market and eventually migrated to supermarket shelves, restaurant menus, and fast casual chains that understood the aspiration even if they couldn't always deliver its substance. The farmers' market didn't fix the food system, but it reminded enough people that a different system was possible, and that reminder turned out to have commercial consequences that reached considerably further than 8,000 Saturday morning markets. At some point in the late 1990s, the modern supermarket quietly added something that changed the fundamental premise of grocery shopping: a hot bar, a deli case full of fully cooked meals, a rotisserie chicken that was ready right now, warm and golden, requiring no preparation, no effort, no planning, just the willingness to be the kind of person who buys a rotisserie chicken at 5:45 on a Tuesday and calls it dinner. And America, it turned out, was absolutely that kind of person. The prepared food section grew. The home cooking rate fell. Nobody said anything, but everyone understood the arrangement. The prepared food section did not arrive without precedent. Supermarket delis had been offering cold cuts, prepared salads, and sliced cheese since the 1950s, and hot prepared food had been available at some stores since the 70s. But the full-scale prepared foods department, with multiple hot items, a soup station, a salad bar, sushi, rotisserie meats, and an implicit promise that you could walk out of a grocery store with a complete dinner without having touched a pan, was a product of the 90s, driven by a specific combination of factors that had been building for years. Time poverty was the primary driver. By the mid-90s, the dual-income household was the American norm rather than the exception, and the question of who was going to cook dinner on a Wednesday night had become genuinely complicated. Both adults had worked all day. Children had activities. The answer that the TV dinner had proposed in the 50s, eat something from a box, had worked for decades but was increasingly unsatisfying to a generation that had grown up watching Food Network and had real opinions about food quality. The prepared food section offered the third option that had been missing: real food, properly cooked, requiring nothing from you except money and a microwave-safe container. The rotisserie chicken became the emblem of this compromise because it was, by most objective measures, a genuinely good product. A whole chicken, slowly rotated over heat until the skin was crisp and the meat was juicy, seasoned with herbs and salt, available at the end of the grocery store at a price competitive with buying a raw chicken and cooking it yourself, which would take an additional hour and produce dirty dishes. The calculation was not difficult. Supermarkets had discovered that the rotisserie chicken was a traffic driver, a purchase that brought people into the store with the specific intention of buying it, and then proceeded to shop for other things while they were there. The chicken was doing more work than its price tag suggested. The hot bar expanded to include items that tracked food, trend cycles with impressive responsiveness. In the early 2000s, it was likely to feature a pasta station, a carved meat option, and several items involving cream sauces. By the 2010s, it had typically added grain bowls, roasted vegetables, and options labelled with the dietary category they served: vegan, gluten-free, paleo, because the shopper visiting the hot bar had developed specific nutritional identities that the bar was expected to accommodate. The prepared food section was not just selling convenience. It was selling a version of the meal you would have cooked if you'd had time and energy, adapted to whoever you believed yourself to be nutritionally. What the prepared food section quietly acknowledged was that cooking, as a daily requirement of household life, had become optional for Americans who could afford to make it optional. This represented a significant cultural shift from even 30 years earlier, when the expectation that someone in the household would cook dinner every night was essentially universal. The shift did not happen dramatically. It happened one rotisserie chicken at a time, one Wednesday evening at a time, until the prepared food section was one of the highest margin departments in the store, and the question of whether someone in the household cooked regularly had become a lifestyle choice rather than a domestic obligation. The kitchen was still there, it just wasn't always necessary. Around 2012, something happened to gluten. It had been minding its own business in wheat products for approximately 10,000 years when it suddenly became, depending on who you asked, either a serious medical concern or a personality type. For the roughly 1% of Americans with celiac disease, gluten-free options were genuinely life-changing. For the considerably larger number of Americans who had read something online and felt vaguely concerned, the gluten-free section became a destination. Grocery stores responded by expanding their offerings, labeling things gluten-free that had never contained gluten and never could, and creating an entirely new vocabulary for describing bread that tasted like a memory of bread. Celiac disease, an autoimmune condition in which gluten, the protein found in wheat, barley and rye, triggers an immune response that damages the small intestine, had been medically understood since the 1940s and had a patient population that needed gluten-free food for genuine medical reasons. For most of the 20th century, eating gluten-free with celiac disease meant careful label reading, limited options, and a diet that required considerable planning and occasional sacrifice of enjoyment. The gluten-free products that existed were functional, rather than pleasurable. Dense breads made from rice flour, crackers that crumbled preemptively, pasta that achieved a texture best described as resigned. The shift that happened around 2012 was not primarily medical. Non-celiac gluten sensitivity, a condition in which people without celiac disease or wheat allergy reported feeling better on a gluten-free diet, had been described in medical literature and was being discussed, amplified, and generalized in the wellness media landscape with a speed and breadth that outpaced the clinical evidence. Books with titles suggesting that wheat was destroying your brain reached bestseller lists. Wellness bloggers documented their gluten-free transformations with before and after energy levels that read like religious conversion narratives. The category exploded. The food industry's response was immediate and impressively comprehensive. Gluten-free certification became a label that appeared on products across every category: bread, pasta, crackers, cookies, cereals, and eventually products like bottled water and fresh vegetables that contained no wheat to begin with and had never posed any gluten risk to anyone. The labelling on these latter products was technically accurate but practically absurd, a consequence of marketing departments correctly identifying that the gluten-free label had become a shorthand for health-conscious and was doing positive brand work regardless of whether the product had any specific relationship to gluten avoidance. Product quality improved dramatically over this period, which was the genuinely good news. The commercial incentive to make gluten-free food that people actually wanted to eat, rather than merely food that people with no other option would tolerate, produced real innovation in alternative flour technology. Bread made from blends of rice flour, tapioca starch, and xanthan gum became genuinely palatable. Gluten-free pasta improved from its previous texture of softened disappointment to something that passed reasonable inspection, if not direct comparison. The patient population with celiac disease, which had spent decades navigating a food system that ignored them, found their options expanding rapidly as the larger non-celiac market funded the product development they had always needed. The cultural peak of gluten-free was somewhere around 2014 to 2016. after which it began a slow retreat from dominance, not disappearing, but yielding the front position to other dietary anxieties that had been queuing patiently behind it. The grocery store aisle that had reorganized itself around gluten-free did not reorganize back. The products remained better formulated and more numerous than before, serving a population that genuinely needed them, and a somewhat larger population that simply preferred them, or found the label reassuring. Gluten had survived its moment of cultural notoriety, and returned to relative quiet, still present in most of the same products, still troublesome to roughly the same 1% of the population, and probably relieved that nobody was making documentaries about it anymore. Walk down the beverage aisle of an American supermarket in the year 2018, and you would encounter something your grandmother would not have recognized as a product category. A 4-foot section of fermented tea in various flavors, each bottle bearing text about gut health, probiotics, and a certain breezy confidence that drinking this particular beverage was a form of self-improvement. Kombucha was joined by cold-pressed juices priced like small investments, adaptogenic drinks, mushroom coffee, and at least 3 types of water that had been enhanced, structured, or otherwise improved upon in ways that water's original designers had apparently missed. Kombucha itself is ancient, a fermented tea beverage made using a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast, consumed in China as far back as 220 BCE, and spreading through Russia and Eastern Europe over subsequent centuries. It arrived in American health food stores in the 90s, made initially by home brewers and small producers, and occupied the same niche as other fermented foods beloved by the natural food community. Genuine nutritional content, acquired taste, strong opinions among enthusiasts. The flavor is tart, slightly vinegary, gently effervescent, a combination that reads as either refreshing or alarming, depending on your relationship to fermentation. The commercial kombucha industry was essentially created by one company, GT's Kombucha, founded by GT Dave in 1995 after he credited his mother's recovery from breast cancer in part to kombucha consumption, began as a small California producer and grew steadily through natural food retail channels. By the time the broader wellness trend of the 2010s reached full saturation, GT's was the dominant brand in a category that had expanded to include dozens of competitors, multiple flavor lines, and shelf presence in conventional supermarkets that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier. The probiotic story was central to kombucha's mainstream ascent. The science of the gut microbiome, the community of bacteria and other microorganisms living in the human digestive system and influencing health in ways that researchers were only beginning to understand, was translating from academic journals into consumer consciousness throughout the 2010s, and the translation was not always precise. The microbiome research was genuinely interesting and genuinely complex. The relationship between specific bacterial strains, specific health outcomes, and specific foods was not straightforward, and the evidence for many probiotic product claims was limited. The marketing, however, was not constrained by the complexity of the science. Gut health became a consumer concept vast enough to encompass everything from yogurt to fermented vegetables to kombucha to a growing line of supplements, each one suggesting that your interior ecosystem needed tending and that this product was the right tool for the job. The cold-pressed juice category that shared shelf space with kombucha operated on a different but related premise, that nutrients could be extracted from fruits and vegetables and consumed in concentrated liquid form, delivering health benefits more efficiently than eating the whole foods they came from. Cold pressing, which used hydraulic pressure rather than heat to extract juice, was claimed to preserve more nutrients than conventional juicing. The resulting products were expensive. $8 to $12 for a 16-ounce bottle was standard, and consumed primarily by urban professionals who were either genuinely committed to the nutritional proposition or found the coloured bottles and clean ingredient list aesthetically consistent with their self-image. Both motivations were commercially valid. The juice companies did not inquire which applied to you. What the kombucha shelf represented at its fullest extent was the complete colonization of the beverage aisle by the wellness concept. The idea that what you drank should be doing something for you beyond hydration, that every sip was an opportunity for optimization, and that plain water, while technically sufficient, was leaving improvement on the table. The aisle that had previously offered soda, juice, water, and sports drinks now offered a taxonomy of functional beverages organized by what they claimed to improve: your gut, your energy, your focus, your stress response, your sleep, all of it addressable, all of it available in a bottle, all of it ready to be placed in your cart as evidence that you are taking your health seriously. Whether it worked was a question for the researchers. Whether it sold was a question already answered. In March of 2020, Americans went to the grocery store in a way they had never gone before, with urgency, with fear, and with a sudden conviction that they needed an amount of toilet paper that bore no rational relationship to the number of people in their household. The pandemic grocery run became a cultural event, a snapshot of collective anxiety rendered in shopping cart contents. Dried beans, previously a humble pantry staple, disappeared from shelves overnight. Yeast became a controlled substance. Flour was hoarded. And then, in the weeks that followed, an interesting thing happened. Americans, suddenly homebound, started cooking. Actually cooking, from scratch. With the flour they had panicked, bought, and some of them, for the first time in decades, found they liked it. The initial panic buying of March 2020 was driven by a specific and not entirely irrational fear that supply chains would break down, that stores would run out of things, that the ordinary abundance of the American supermarket was more fragile than it appeared. This fear was understandable and in some limited ways correct. Supply chains did experience disruptions. Some products did become genuinely scarce, but the buying behavior it triggered bore little relationship to actual shortage probabilities. Toilet paper, which is manufactured domestically and was not facing supply constraints, disappeared because everyone bought extra simultaneously. A self-fulfilling prophecy of scarcity created entirely by the anticipation of scarcity. The shelves were empty because everyone was afraid the shelves would be empty, which is a sentence that captures something essential about collective human behavior under stress. The flour shortage was more interesting because it revealed something specific about how Americans had organized their relationship with cooking. Flour had been quietly available on grocery store shelves in essentially unlimited quantities for decades, because most Americans were not baking. Commercial bread production had replaced home baking so thoroughly that the average household consumed flour primarily through purchased products and used very little of the raw ingredient directly. When the pandemic removed the option of going out for food and simultaneously provided time that had not previously existed, a significant number of Americans discovered that they wanted to bake bread, which requires flour, which turned out not to have been stocked in sufficient quantities for a population that had collectively decided to start baking simultaneously. The sourdough boom was the most documented expression of this. Sourdough bread, which requires maintaining a live starter culture of wild yeast and bacteria, demands time, attention, and a tolerance for the slightly unpredictable behavior of a living fermentation project. Precisely the kind of slow, process-oriented cooking activity that the previous 30 years of food culture had been systematically designing out of people's lives. In the spring of 2020, with nowhere to go and nothing but time, Americans made starters. They fed them daily. They named them. They posted photographs of their loaves on social media with a pride that would have been recognizable to a 1950s housewife presenting a particularly successful casserole, though the aesthetic language had changed considerably. The grocery store during this period was a strange and altered place. Masked shoppers, directional arrows on the floors, plexiglass barriers at the checkout, empty sections where paper products and dried goods had been, and full sections of things nobody had panicked about. There was plenty of saffron. The kumquat display was untouched. Fresh pasta had been overlooked entirely. The things that were gone revealed a portrait of collective anxiety. What people believed they needed to feel secure when everything felt uncertain, and the things that remained revealed what they had not thought to fear, which was equally telling. What endured after the immediate crisis passed was a modest but real shift in home cooking rates that food researchers documented through the following years. The pandemic had reintroduced cooking as a daily practice to households that had largely abandoned it, and some of those households, having rediscovered the satisfaction of making something from scratch, did not fully abandon it again. The sourdough starters mostly died. The impulse that had created them did not entirely, and the grocery store's flour aisle, returned to its previous state of full and unremarkable supply, was never quite taken for granted in quite the same way again. The grocery delivery service was not a pandemic invention. Peapod had been offering online grocery delivery since 1989, but the years around 2020 accelerated its adoption in ways that no marketing budget ever could. Suddenly, the proposition of actually driving to a store, walking through a store and returning from a store began to feel like an elaborate optional activity that a significant number of Americans were prepared to skip indefinitely. Grocery delivery, grocery pickup, curbside service. The supermarket had spent a century designing itself to be a destination, and now its customers were deciding, politely but firmly, that they would like the supermarket to come to them. Peapod's 1989 launch was visionary and commercially premature in roughly equal measure. The infrastructure for online grocery ordering in the late 80s, dial-up, connections, no standardized e-commerce systems, limited household computer penetration, made the service genuinely difficult to use and expensive to operate. The company survived through the 90s by serving a narrow demographic of busy urban professionals who found the premium worth paying, and it demonstrated clearly that the demand was real, even when the technology was inadequate. The internet boom of the late 90s brought new entrants, most famously Webvan, which launched in 1999 with enormous venture capital backing, a promise to transform grocery retail entirely, and a business model that expanded faster than its unit economics could support. Webvan filed for bankruptcy in 2001, taking $250 million with it, and the grocery delivery category spent the following decade in a quiet period of reduced ambition. Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods in 2017 was the signal that the quiet period was ending. The combination of Amazon's logistics infrastructure and Whole Foods' retail footprint created the first credible pathway to grocery delivery at scale, and the competitive response from traditional supermarkets was immediate. Instacart, founded in 2012 as a platform connecting shoppers with gig workers who would shop and deliver from existing stores, had been growing steadily and accelerated dramatically. Walmart launched grocery pickup. Kroger partnered with delivery services. The grocery delivery race that Peapod had started 30 years earlier was finally attracting the capital and infrastructure it had always required. The pandemic removed the last friction. Going to the store had never been purely a practical act. It was also a social one, a sensory experience, a break in the day's routine. The pandemic made the social element hazardous, and the sensory experience alarming, and grocery delivery, which had previously appealed primarily to people with very limited time, now appeal to people who had all the time in the world and simply preferred not to stand near strangers in an enclosed space. Adoption rates jumped across demographic groups that had resisted delivery before. Older adults who had never shopped online learned the interfaces. People who had considered delivery a luxury normalized it as a standard option. What the delivery transition did to the grocery store as an experience is worth considering. The stores that supermarket designers had spent decades carefully engineering, the produce at the entrance, the dairy at the back, the bread smell diffusing from the bakery, the end caps positioned for maximum impulse purchase, were designed for a specific kind of human interaction. Embodied, ambulatory, sensory, subject to the store's carefully arranged environmental cues. The delivery shopper bypasses all of this. They do not smell the bread. They do not pass the end caps. They are not slowed by music calibrated to reduce walking speed. They submit a list and receive a box. The store's entire persuasion apparatus is simply not in the room. This is, depending on your perspective, either liberation or loss. The grocery store had been a community space in ways that were easy to overlook until they weren't available. A place where you ran into neighbours, where you made small decisions about what to eat that week, where the rhythm of shopping was also the rhythm of providing for yourself and your household. The delivery app provides the food without the experience. It is efficient in exactly the way a vending machine is efficient, and it produces a similar quality of transaction. Complete, convenient, and entirely devoid of the accidental pleasures that the physical store, for all its manipulation, had always also provided. There is a psychological phenomenon called choice overload, and the American grocery store is its natural habitat. Studies have found that when you give people too many options, they buy less, decide more slowly, and feel worse about their choices afterward. The average American supermarket in the 2010s carried between 30 and 50,000 different products. The cereal aisle alone, just cereals, might offer 80 options. The yogurt case could take a small portion of your afternoon. At some point, the promise of abundance began to feel less like freedom and more like a homework assignment you had not studied for, and you just needed someone to tell you which granola to buy so you could go home. The research that named this phenomenon was conducted by psychologists Sheena Iyengar and Mark Lepper in a study published in 2000, often called the Jam Study. At a gourmet food store, they set up a tasting booth with either 6 varieties of jam or 24 varieties of jam and measured both how many people stopped to taste and how many people made a purchase. The booth with 24 jams attracted more visitors, more options seemed more interesting, but the booth with 6 jams produced 10 times more purchases. Given too many choices, people found it harder to decide, were less satisfied with the choices they made, and more often chose to make no choice at all. The study was conducted with jam, but its implications radiated outward to encompass every aisle of every grocery store in the country, all of which had been operating on the assumption that more variety was always better. The expansion of grocery product variety had been continuous and accelerating since the 1980s. New products launched in the food industry numbered in the tens of thousands every year through the 90s and 2000s, the majority of them line extensions, new flavors, new sizes, new formulations of existing products, rather than genuinely new categories. The yogurt aisle expanded from a few basic varieties to a taxonomy of full-fat, low-fat, non-fat, Greek, Icelandic, Australian, drinkable, squeezable, organic, conventional, sweetened, unsweetened, and flavoured, in combinations ranging from strawberry to birthday cake to flavours that suggested a food scientist had been given a dare. Each new variety occupied shelf space. Each new variety required a decision. The cumulative decision load of a weekly grocery shop had grown substantially without anyone explicitly choosing to make it harder. The response from some corners of the food industry was a counter-movement towards simplicity and curation. Trader Joe's, which had been operating since the 1960s but reached cultural saturation in the 2000s, built its entire model on the opposite proposition from the conventional supermarket. Approximately 4,000 products, almost entirely private label, selected by buyers who had already decided what was worth your attention. You could not buy every brand of peanut butter at Trader Joe's. You could buy Trader Joe's peanut butter, which they had decided was good, and the decision had been made for you. Customers responded to this with enthusiasm that bordered on devotion, and the queue outside a new Trader Joe's opening has consistently been one of the more sociologically interesting phenomena in American retail. The broader lesson that the 47 varieties problem teaches about the American grocery store is one that the store's designers had not fully anticipated when they were building the abundance cathedral of the mid-century. That abundance without organization produces paralysis. That freedom of choice requires manageable options to function as freedom rather than burden, and that what shoppers sometimes want most is not more to choose from, but someone they trust to have already chosen. The supermarket that solved this problem, that offered genuine variety while reducing the cognitive cost of navigating it, was the one that understood its customers well enough to know that sometimes the most valuable thing a grocery store can offer is the one that you came in for, clearly labelled, easy to find, and not surrounded by 46 alternatives demanding equal consideration. The first self-checkout machines appeared in American supermarkets in the 1990s, and the grocery store would never be the same. The idea was frictionless efficiency. Scan your items, bag them yourself, pay without waiting in line, leave with your dignity intact. The reality for many Americans was an ongoing negotiation with a machine that did not trust them. Unexpected item in the bagging area. Please wait for an attendant. Have you scanned your loyalty card? The self-checkout did not replace the checkout line so much as it replaced the checkout line with a slightly more stressful and personally accountable checkout line, overseen by a machine with trust issues and the patience of a particularly humorless bureaucrat. The first commercially deployed self-checkout system was installed in 1986 at a Kroger in Atlanta by a company called Optimal Robotics. It was slow, occasionally bewildering, and required a staff member to stand nearby and assist anyway, which somewhat undermined the efficiency proposition. The technology improved through the 90s, and by the early 2000s self-checkout lanes had become standard in most major supermarket chains, promoted as a labour-saving innovation that would reduce wait times and improve the shopping experience for customers who preferred to avoid human interaction at the register, a preference that turned out to be more widely held than anyone had explicitly predicted. The bagging area weight sensor was the self-checkout's signature contribution to American stress culture. Designed to prevent theft by confirming that the weight of the item placed in the bagging area matched the weight of the scanned item, it produced false positives with a frequency that suggested the calibration had been set by someone who expected shoppers to be both perfectly consistent and slightly robotic. The reusable bag you brought from home had weight. The item you scanned and placed gently, but apparently not gently enough, had disturbed the sensor's equilibrium. The machine noticed. The machine announced the disturbance. The machine waited, with its yellow light blinking in the universal language of mechanical disappointment, for the attendant to come and absolve you of whatever transgression had occurred. You had not stolen anything. You had put a cucumber in a bag incorrectly, and the cucumber would need to be verified. The attendant, managing 6 to 8 self-checkout lanes, simultaneously became one of the more quietly stressful jobs in American retail, responsible for a territory of constant minor emergencies, each one requiring a key turn or a password and a brief exchange with a customer who was either apologetic, frustrated, or had simply stopped caring and was holding the cucumber at the sensor with the expression of someone who has nothing left to lose. The position combined the social demands of customer service with the technical demands of machine maintenance and the spatial demands of covering a large area quickly, all for approximately the same hourly wage as the cashier position it had been introduced to reduce. The shrink problem, retail industry language for inventory losses from theft, became more complicated with self-checkout in ways that researchers began documenting in the 2010s. Studies found consistently higher loss rates in self-checkout lanes than in staffed lanes, attributable to a combination of intentional theft, accidental scanning errors, and a grey area of behaviour in which customers failed to scan items without clearly deciding not to. The machine created a moral environment that was subtly different from the human cashier, less socially monitored, more individually responsible, and calibrated in ways that made certain small dishonest acts feel less consequential than they would have felt with a person watching. Whole Foods removed self-checkout from many of its locations in 2024, and other chains began quietly reducing self-checkout capacity after years of expansion, a correction that acknowledged what the machines had never fully delivered, the seamless, fast, frictionless experience that had been the original promise. The self-checkout had saved on labour costs while transferring the labour to the customer, broken down regularly, generated more stress than the checkout line it replaced, and contributed to a mild ongoing crisis of shrink that required its own staffing solution. It was a marvel of American retail thinking, a technology introduced to solve one problem that created 3 new ones, adopted everywhere, and retreated from slowly, with no one quite admitting what had happened. The American grocery store has not stayed the same. It has expanded, contracted, reorganized, reinvented itself, added a wine bar, installed self-checkout, removed the self-checkout, and occasionally burned through an entire decade trying to convince people that low-fat cheese was worth eating. It has reflected every major anxiety and aspiration of the culture it serves. The post-war hunger for abundance, the 70s fear of what was in the food, the 80s discovery that food could be a status symbol, the 90s explosion of snacking, the current uneasy coexistence of 47 types of oat milk, and a man in the chip aisle who has simply given up. The grocery store is not just where we shop, it is where we are. The journey from the 1950s housewife in her heels to the 2023 shopper in their pajamas is not a story of decline, though it has been told that way. It is a story of renegotiation, a century-long conversation between Americans and their food supply about what meals mean, what effort is worth, whose labour matters, and what kind of life the grocery store is supposed to support. The woman in heels was performing competence in a system that had decided competence looked like a certain kind of presentation. The person in pajamas is performing something different. The refusal to treat a routine errand as a social performance, the casual assertion that they have enough self-possession to go out in public without armour, and enough confidence to let the grocery store be what it functionally is, a building full of food rather than a theatre in which they must play a specific role. Both positions are responses to the same question. What do I owe the world when I go to buy groceries? The answer has shifted considerably. The social surveillance that organised mid-century shopping, where what you bought and how you looked while buying it was readable information about who you were and how well you were doing, has attenuated significantly. The anonymity of the modern supermarket, enormous and busy and staffed by people too busy to notice your outfit, makes the performance optional. The rise of delivery makes it avoidable entirely. The pajama shopper is not unaware of social norms. They have assessed the situation and concluded that this particular norm carries no enforcement mechanism worth worrying about. They are correct. The grocery store has also become a record of American health, and the record is complicated. The prepared food section and the frozen aisle have never been larger. The snack section has never offered more options. The average American household wastes roughly 30% of the food it purchases, a statistic that represents an extraordinary amount of money, resources, and the labour of everyone who grew, processed, and shipped the food that ended up being thrown away. These are not separate facts. They're all part of the same story about a food system that produces abundance efficiently and distributes it unequally, that has engineered pleasure with extraordinary skill and nutritional quality with considerably less consistency, that has made feeding yourself easier than it has ever been in human history, and somehow also more confusing. What the grocery store has always done, underneath all of its engineering and marketing and nutrition panels and seasonal displays, is hold a mirror up to the people shopping in it. The post-war supermarket reflected a nation flush with optimism and hungry for the promise of plenty. The health food panic of the 80s reflected a nation beginning to worry about what plenty had cost. The specialty food era reflected a nation discovering that what you ate could be a form of self-expression. The delivery app reflects a nation that has become comfortable enough with abundance to not even need to go and get it. The woman who pushed her chrome cart in 1955 in her best dress, carefully selecting her Campbell's and her Jell-O powder, was doing something real, providing for her household, navigating her social world, exercising the skills and expertise her life had developed. The person rolling into the parking lot tonight in slippers to grab a rotisserie chicken and a bag of fancy chips and something green to feel better about the bag of fancy chips is doing something real too. The store they shop in is bigger, louder, more overwhelming, better stocked, and considerably more confusing. The hunger it's trying to satisfy, for food, for ease, for a sense that the week is manageable and dinner will happen, is exactly the same. It has always been the same, and the grocery store, for all its changes, has always known that, and built itself accordingly. So here we are. You've made it through the whole journey, from the chrome-wheeled carts of 1955 to the self-checkout machine that accused you of stealing a cucumber. From the woman in heels selecting her Jell-O mold with the gravity of someone making an important decision, because she was to the person in pajama pants at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday holding a rotisserie chicken and a bag of something they'll probably finish before they get to the car. You've watched the TV dinner arrive and the formal meal quietly leave. You've seen oat bran rise and fall with the speed of a minor celebrity. You've witnessed an entire nation decide in the span of about 3 years that gluten was the problem, and then more or less move on. You've been inside the warehouse store when the 48-pack of granola bars made complete sense, and you've stood in front of the yogurt case long enough to question whether freedom of choice is all it was promised to be. It sounds funny. Most of it is funny. But underneath the fondue sets and the Snackwell's cookies and the kombucha shelf and the self-checkout's blinking yellow light of judgment, there is something that isn't funny at all. There is the woman who cooked every night for 30 years without being asked if she enjoyed it. There is the family that ate TV dinners not because they were modern, but because they were tired. There is the kid whose school lunch was a Lunchable because nobody had time that morning, and the farmer at the Saturday market who got up before dawn so that someone could hand them $8 for a tomato and feel good about it. There is the warehouse worker and the delivery driver and the shelf stocker and the person at the register who has heard the self-checkout announce an unexpected item in the bagging area approximately 9,000 times and has kept showing up anyway. Food is never just food. It is time and labour and love and anxiety and memory and the particular smell of a grocery store your mother used to take you to that you would recognise anywhere, even now, even decades later, even as dark. It is the casserole someone made when you were sick. It is the cereal you ate standing over the sink the morning everything fell apart. It is the bread you baked during a pandemic because you needed something to do with your hands and your fear, and it rose imperfectly, and you ate it warm, and it was enough. America's relationship with its grocery store has been strange and commercial, and occasionally deeply misguided. It has also been a century-long attempt to answer the oldest question any household faces every single day. How do we feed ourselves, and how do we make that mean something? The answers have changed. They will keep changing. The store will reorganize again. Something new will appear in the beverage aisle. Someone will invent a snack with a name that hasn't been invented yet. The self-checkout will be removed and then reinstalled. The cycle will continue, because the hunger underneath it, not just for food, but for ease and abundance, and the quiet reassurance that the week is manageable and dinner will happen does not go away. So tonight, as you settle into wherever you are, your clean bed, your warm room, your house with its refrigerator humming softly in the kitchen, full of things you chose, maybe take just a moment. For the woman in the heels who knew every aisle by heart. For the tired parent who opened the can because that was what there was time for. For the farmers and the drivers and the stockers and the bakers and every person in the long chain between the soil and your table who made it possible for you to eat today without thinking very hard about it. They fed you, generation after generation. In every form the grocery store has ever taken, somebody fed you. That's worth something. It might even be worth everything. Sleep well.